strongest arguments for family stuff. Anyways, let's not to go off track. Our silent listener here, mostly silent listener, asked, they commented, they said, from what I've heard, freedom sounds a lot like consciousness. I thought of a thought experiment I could give about free will. We'll see the second thing right now, but freedom is not like consciousness because we can impute this kind of freedom on anything. Remember back that I said we could give this over to a atom of gold, for example. An atom of gold has freedom. It does.
Monoatomic gold?
Yeah, monoatomic gold. Yeah. Because the atom as atom determines itself as the kind of being that it is. And it also has its own substantive self-enduring relationship.
The same applies to consciousness. You're basically describing it as consciousness, in my view.
Well, I would say that certainly consciousness would have this aspect, but it's not because it's based on consciousness.
It's equivalent to it, what I can see. I mean, if you feel there's a difference, I'm interested to hear it.
All right, like the difference would be that consciousness.
My free will example.
Let me go with the consciousness thing first. So the difference would be that consciousness specifically for Hegel, in his perspective, consciousness is defined as the opposition of knowledge to an object. It's a knowing with an object which is grasped as something other than it. This has a form of self-determination. The most concrete form is that the original self-determination is that consciousness as such is really always self-consciousness. The undergirding reason is because the knowledge of an object is literally just the objectified knowledge of consciousness itself. What consciousness always has as an object, essentially, is its own structure of knowing, and consciousness is just that knowing. So, say if you have sense certainty, which, is Hegel's name for a radical empiricism like Hume, where you just have this, you don't specify it, it's just like this given by empirical experience, sensuousness. That which in the this, which is cognitively only the this, forget about the sense part of it, because you don't know the sense part of it. It's a given. You're taking it for granted, but you don't actually know it. It's like saying, okay, I know what red is because I've seen red, but you're not actually explicating it. You're not really putting forth any knowledge of what redness is. To know, so, in knowing just like, okay, red is this thing, you point to the color red. All you're saying is really this. What I know is thisness. Well, what is thisness? Hegel says, well, it's just an empty universal. So, what you really have as an object is not the color red. What you really have as a cognitive object, really, is this empty universal. And this empty universal is the structure of your knowing. So, what you really are is self-conscious. What your conscious is conscious of consciousness itself. So this has a self-determining structure. Obviously then gold would also have a self-determining structure, but not in the way that consciousness does. Gold would have a self-determining structure in that gold has a self-determining process of being in which, obviously whatever the subatomic particles, protons, neutrons, we don't even know if neutrons are real anymore, and electrons, by some power of matter, immanent to matter, which is not upon matter, but it's something within matter itself, come together, form themselves, and maintain themselves in this relationship to themselves by their own nature and power. That is what makes them self-determining. So this is not an act of will, it's not an act of knowing, it's not an act of perception. So that's why, at least on the Hegelian terms, that's not consciousness. Though consciousness certainly has a structure of self-determination, which everything really has, to some extent or other. I don't know if that clarified anything.
I haven't changed my opinion, but it did clarify things. I mean, if something is described identically to something else, how do you distinguish it? Not saying that Hegel necessarily even knew what he was talking about. Can I give my example about free will, or if that's too off topic, I don't mind just
listening. No, go ahead.
So I've been talking about this for a while, and for a while it did not go anywhere. Then we thought we went somewhere, and then it was sort of set back a lot, so it's been an evolving mess. But finally got a thought experiment to me that makes sense, where just imagine that, let's say, this is hypothetical, okay, so just bear with me, I'm not expecting any endorsements on this, but hypothetically, let's say the laws of physics are determined, we know them. We build a machine that then tells us exactly what's going to happen in the future. Let's just simplify it to, I'm the only one who has this machine, because I've decided I want to give myself that edge. It's the perfect predictor. So then, what is the meaning of free will if I can then intercede on what will is, without my intercession, destined? Anyone confused as to what I just said? I realize it was a lot.
No, okay, I heard this. No, what I would say is, in order to bring this into proper... okay, all right, go continue.
I just want to make sure if anyone's lost now, I should clarify it, because it might get more complicated.
Okay, so you have a machine that can predict the future perfectly.
It's just a thought experiment, but let's say hypothetically such a machine could exist, and I'm the sole possessor of it, then I could hypothetically intercede in what would have been destiny had I not interceded, aka just the flow of things. Like, I'm trying to establish basically not an argument for free will, but parameters on it.
Yeah, go ahead. It's pretty straightforward.
So hypothetical, that's fine. Now my power to affect the future, I have more free will in a way than anyone else, because I've got this edge. And free will is the ability to have your will be manifested outside of your immediacy, or your own subjectivity, or whatever you want to call it. It seems to kind of come down to an ability to determine the future, how much freedom there is to intercede on what would have been had there not been any contemplation of would have been inevitable.
I think
yeah, go ahead.
The example makes it a little tricky to think about, but I think this issue of prediction...
I can reframe it again to make it even more clear, okay? What we are functionally is simulators of the future. At the very minimum, we're simulators of the present, because that's why we can perceive our immediacy, but we're like more advanced as humans, so we tend to also simulate the future, usually horribly. But essentially everybody has what amounts to extremely limited free will, because if everyone is going for this, it's like a crab in the bucket situation with when you have finite things that everybody in theory wants, right? Very complicated thing, but essentially comes down to choice on the level of how accurate your simulation is of the future. Not in an absolute sense, but relative to everybody else. If everyone is around the same level, there's almost no, quote, free will in the sense that it's a crab in the bucket situation. Free will being the ability to sort of have something that others, in some sense, have either chosen not to have or can't have. I mean, hopefully that helps, and thanks for listening.
Yeah, go ahead.
I don't know if this will be relevant, but I actually wrote this to somebody recently, just because they were using prediction language to talk about people and stuff like that. And I think there's a way in which you can kind of understand free, evolving, open, adaptive, dynamic feedback loop in self-aware predictors, where it's like, what I wrote is, I think one of the special things about people is that they are aware when someone else is predicting them. And so a person responds and adapts to being predicted. And in doing so, accounts for the way in which the others predict them as part of their response. So two people responding to each other are predicting each other and predicting the ways in which the other predicts them. This produces a free dynamic where our knowledge of our own predictability allows an intervention which we can make use of to alter activity. And so patterns that emerge from this circumstance are both logical, pattern producing, so they have a structure, but at the same time they are open because It depends on what I want to do, and it depends on what you want to do, and it depends on what we each think each other wants to do. Adaptive, because we're adapting to each other. Dynamic, because as you change, I change, and as I change, you change. And we change ourselves in light of the way we're changing ourselves. And evolving, where we maintain this logical pattern that we're producing between one another self-awarely. So because in being able to predict someone else and being aware that they're predicting me, I'm able actually to account for that and intervene in what I'm doing. And their knowledge that I can do that means that we both are predictably unpredictable or unpredictably predictable, so to speak. And so we can build patterns between one another that enable us to retain this capacity to feedback with one another productively in ways that could either impair us if we're antagonistic to each other or harmonize if we are pro-social, ethical, and so on.
Could I comment on that, or would you like to respond?
Yeah, you go ahead.
All right, I'll comment on that. So I'll go back to the first example you gave about the perfect prediction machine. You're the only one who has it, and therefore you can interject into the flow of causality and meddle with things that otherwise would happen had people not known about it, or had you not known about it. That's certainly an example of more freedom on a certain level, but it's not an example of free will, and there's a few reasons why. One reason would be that the free will concerns the capacity to determine our will, not the will of others, but rather really our own will. So in this case, the perfect predictor would be of no use for this consideration, because, for example, as the perfect predictor of the machine would then tell you what you would do, you could just say, "Oh, well, I'm not going to do it." Unless you take the position, say, of that we have some kind of Greek fatedness, in which it's not a causal fate of the sort of the physical determinism, but rather a causal fate of a categorical causality. You're gonna die on Monday. Okay, it's and somehow that you were gonna die because you went on a plane. You decided, okay, I'm not gonna go on the plane. But somehow you die. You decide to stay home, do nothing. You die from a heart attack. Because the fate was you were going to die anyways. Well, that's just kind of a purely abstract notion of fate that has no efficacy to it, really. So we can dispense with that. But on the other side, if it could predict and it told you you're going to do this, you could just go say, well, I'm not going to do it. And that's that. Is the machine going to force you? Well, then it wouldn't be your will. So it wouldn't be able to predict your will. So, the reflexive problem of self-knowing leads to an ambiguity, an indeterminacy, in which you always have to decide. There's no given to the fact that you could know your future and not have the chance to say no. That if you didn't have that chance, then
just a model. Sorry, just so it doesn't get too off track. It's just a model. The idea is that you are an extremely crappy version of this perfect predictor machine. It's not a metaphor that could be unmade. It is itself the example that simplifies the reality.
Yeah. So even if you were the self-predictor, you would say, on Tuesday, I'm going to do this thing. Well, that's not a prediction. Right? That's or even
the
say...
The idea with free will is that you can control other people. You said it's not, you can control yourself. I'm well, I think that's maybe part of it. So it was obviously very simplified, and I'll grant you that it's way better to control yourself than others, but that was a simplified version for the layperson.
No, I'm not critiquing you on that ground. I'm just saying that on the level that we're talking about, freedom is a contextual nexus. So there's a level of a self-control, but it's not merely a level of self-control. So there's a level of that. You can always decide otherwise, but that's not what makes it free will as such. There's also the level of willing my will, and to will my will is not the same level, because I may have a will. So I may have a desire to eat a burger. Certainly that's my will, and my freedom would be to actually go and eat that burger. But supposing that I had some reasons in which, I can mediate to this and give myself a justification for why should I even bother to go eat that burger? Or, is it really important for me to get out of my bed and go and eat, drive 10 minutes to the McDonald's and get a burger? It's a pretty trivial, silly example, but, one isn't free in merely following through on one's desires. One is free in understanding and justifying one's desires to oneself. And the maximal form of freedom is not even just giving a justification, but giving justification for justification itself. That's the freedom Hegel offers. One, that's the power of the logic, in which you have the justification of justification itself. You have the rationality of reason itself, according to reason's own self-determination. That's what makes it freedom as such. It doesn't make it a freedom, but freedom as such, absolute. And Hegel says this isn't just